All right, guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I'm your host, Darren Freeman, joined this week again by Matt Karoly. You know him from Rise Up Reader. You see him on Twitter at Matt Karoly. And today we're going to be talking about the Falcons' loss to the Cleveland Browns. We're going to be talking about their upcoming Week 11 matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, as well as answering your guys' mailbag questions. And as we usually do on this show, we kick things off by talking about any sort of roster moves that have happened with the Falcons over the last week. And a big one happened today. The Falcons activated Deion Jones, their starting middle linebacker, who has missed every game since that week 1 game against Philadelphia. They activated him from the injured reserve. He's been missed 8 games with a foot injury. And to make room for Deion Jones, they cut the great Reese Odiambo. But I don't think anybody's going to be shedding any tears for Mr. Odiambo simply because Deion Jones is back. So the big question, we talked a little bit about sort of what our expectations were with Deion Jones on last week's show. I know we have maybe a mailbag question or two involving that. But the big question really is, will Deion Jones play this weekend against Dallas? I know, Matt, we talked about this on last week or the week before, whenever it was, but discussing that maybe the Falcons would hold Deion Jones out this week, given the fact that the Falcons have a short week the following week against New Orleans on Thanksgiving. And Dan Quinn has sort of been tiptoeing around whether or not, been non-committal about whether he's going to play or not. So your thoughts on this whole Deion Jones? Will he play this week, or you think he's going to sit a week?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on a lot of the points that I would make. It is kind of encouraging, though, that they did activate him. I know they still had, when they announced that he was practicing or starting to practice somewhat a week or so ago, that was the start of that 21-day window. So they didn't necessarily need to activate him this week. So the fact that they did do that, you would think a little bit means that he has a good shot to play. I mean, we won't know a lot until we see the first injury report tomorrow. But I am a little bit more encouraged than I was a week ago that he's going to play. And, I think, or I'm wondering, at least speculating, whether this past week's game, the result being a loss that none of us expected, and the fact that now this week and pretty much every week from here on out becomes must-win territory, are they going to rush, maybe rush isn't the best word, but are they going to try to push him or hopefully have him now play the rest of the games this season? So again, won't know a lot until tomorrow after practice, but like I said, I am more optimistic now that he is going to play this week than I was maybe last week.
Yeah, we'll have to see. If he was definitely ready to go, I think Dan Quinn would have said as much yesterday or today. And unless I missed something that he said today, then, but if, it's a process to work him back, I would like to, I guess for me, and I won't make any predictions because we both predicted that they wouldn't sign Bruce Irvin, and that didn't necessarily work out.
Sure.
But it does seem like it's sort of setting up that he might sit out. Or, one possibility is that if he's healthy enough to play, but they're worried about sort of, rushing him, maybe they can give him some snaps, a couple of series, and just sort of hold him out, like start him the game, see how he responds to that, and then okay, give him a quick hook if he needs it. So that's another option as opposed to just the play him the entire game or not play him at all. So we'll have to see what happens, and it's really up to the doctors more so than the team and how Deion is recovering and feeling and whatnot. So we'll find out.
Yeah, I mean, either result, I'd rather they hold him out. I mean, I said, again, none of us thought the result that happened on Sunday was going to happen. And, I was feeling confident that these next 2 games, they could get through without him. Now that's up for debate. But I think his long-term health is so much more important than trying to sneak into these playoffs. I know fans might not like to hear that, but I think honestly the best move would be to hold them out just because it's a short week. And again, I'm still feeling somewhat optimistic. We're going to get into it later in the show, but I still think they can beat this Cowboys team at home. They're what 3-2 at home. They have a above 500 record at home, so the home cooking has been pretty good to them. And I think if he doesn't go, I still feel like they can get through it without him heading into that big Thanksgiving Day matchup. Hopefully, to have him then fully healthy and ready to go and intercept Drew Brees like he's known to do.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that, and maybe I agree with you, maybe I don't. We'll find out in a moment. But before we get into that, let's talk about this Browns game. And it's funny because last week we were on this show saying like, oh, this win over the Redskins is arguably the most impressive win of the season for the Falcons. And now this week you can certainly make a strong, compelling argument. I would love to hear someone make an argument otherwise that this is the most disappointing loss of the Falcons 2018 season, given sort of how lackluster they were. The Steeler game sort of had the mantle prior to this game, and to sort of see a repeat performance against that, at least against the Steelers, you could excuse it a little bit because you're thinking, oh, that's a Steeler team that's a playoff team, and the Steelers have been, uncharacteristically bad in certain areas, and they, came alive against the Falcons. And this Browns team, while not a complete doormat team or anything like that, like they have historically been these last couple of years, they've shown a lot of progress in a lot of areas. Their defense is rather good. It was a little disappointing to see the defense struggle to the degree that it did against the Browns offense that had been one of the worst in the league throughout the season. And the offense just really not being able to get anything going other than maybe one or two drives in this game, even against a good Browns defense. So, Matt, I'm curious sort of what were your thoughts on this game? Were there any standout positive performances? The only one I could really think about is Devontae Casey with his interception. But for the most part, it was a lot of not a lot of bad performances, but a lot of middling, just like, oh yeah, that guy had a normal performance for him. I guess, Julio Jones had a normal Julio Jones performance, so that's probably a good one. But not a whole lot of sort of like, oh, that guy played really well in the Browns game that we'll be talking about, weeks and months from now.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot. I'm glad you mentioned Julio then. I think he was a bright spot, him getting over that 10,000 yard mark for his career and breaking Calvin's record. That that was one of the noteworthy things that we could be happy about. But like you said, for the majority, it's so crazy how last week, there was really nothing. There wasn't a whole lot you could nitpick at all or say negatively about them in that Washington game. It was a complete performance, all three phases, and then to follow it up the next week and do a complete 180, and there's pretty much very little positive to say, and you could just nitpick and say negative things about the whole performance. But it really, for me, I mean, the main takeaway was just the lack of effort, and the players talked about it. It's been talked about quite a bit with Devondre Campbell's comments after the game saying they took the Browns lightly, and they expected to just figure it out because they were playing the Cleveland Browns. And for me, that's just so disappointing because of the fact that, again, that rests on the coaching staff, and Dan Quinn as the leader there always talks about bringing the energy, bringing the juice. Every game is a championship atmosphere type of performance. And as a 4-4 team with the struggles that they've had, they're fighting for their playoff lives. There's no reason they should be taking any team lightly. And like you said, I mean, the Browns, historically they're a doormat franchise, but they do have talent, and guys like Myles Garrett, guys like they're rookies, but Baker Mayfield and Nick Chubb, I mean, they were high picks for a reason, and they've showed some of those reasons why they were high picks. So the fact that they took a team like that again does have some talent to speak of, it was just embarrassing. And for me moving forward, it's hard to know what to expect from this team now, because the week prior we saw they're at an all-time high. They can contend with maybe any team in the league, and then you followed it up, and you're at an all-time low, and it seems like you can't contend with even the worst teams, at least record-wise, in this league. So for me, those were the two main takeaways. Is just the lack of effort, the lack of preparation that the coaching staff put into this game, and then long-term picture, bigger picture is just what to make of this team consistency-wise, because again, we've seen performances against Carolina where the offensive line looks great and they can run the football and pound it on anybody. We saw that in Washington then too, and then then you see moments like the Steelers game where, again, you talk about them being a respectable opponent and a playoff caliber team, but kind of just laid over and let them do whatever they wanted to the Falcons. So it's hard to make what to make of this team moving forward, and it's going to be hard to predict this next game even or the games after that until you see kind of some consistent level of play from all three phases. So yeah, those were my two big takeaways from this Cleveland debacle.
Yeah, I think watching the All-22 today, it was very clear to me that I think the Falcons sort of went into this game thinking sort of, I think what we all fell into this trap. Obviously, we don't get paid millions of dollars to not fall into this trap on a weekly basis. But I think we all sort of looked at this Browns team as saying, like, yeah, they have some talent, but they can't hang with the Falcons for 4 quarters. And I think the Falcons sort of went into this game basically doing the things that they've done the last couple of games reasonably successfully. And I made note of this earlier today on Twitter and watching some of their play action passing. They've had a lot of success recently with the play action passing. And you've seen sort of games throughout the season when they can get the play action passing going. They are a really hard team to beat. And when they don't get it going, they are a little bit more beatable. And the Browns, I think, really did a good job. It wasn't like it took rocket science or anything, but I think they schemed to basically slow down the Falcons' play action passing. And did a good job doing that. And then when the Falcons couldn't consistently generate their explosive plays off of that, and then you had a couple of other hiccups here or there, and all of a sudden, you're just a pretty mundane offense, and you throw that in with the defensive side of the ball for the Falcons, where the Browns threw some new looks, in particular that full house backfield when they had three backs in the backfield with Baker Mayfield. I was about to call him Brady Quinn because someone made a joke earlier today about making Baker look like Brady, and I was like Brady Quinn. But anyway, sorry. And so like the Browns, I think they threw that out in like the middle part of the second quarter. So it wasn't even like they started the game doing that. They started the game doing some other stuff, and it didn't quite work. And then they sort of made that adjustment and threw that new wrinkle out there in the second quarter, and it basically took the Falcons. I think that was their first scoring drive where they scored a touchdown. And then it sort of took the Falcons a full drive to adjust to that. And then, by that point, they just started to get some momentum going. And that's when they got the running game really going. And, it's just a simple reality that the Browns seemingly wanted it more. And they came out, with some new things and with a new coaching staff, prepared to basically like, okay, our season starts today and we got an opportunity to take down this Falcons team. And they went the extra mile, or, whatever you want to say, the normal mile of really coming up with a game plan that was going to be really successful against the Falcon team. And you can argue that the Falcons didn't necessarily do that. They were like, oh, we have a top 5 offense and we can score on anybody, and we're just going to do what we've been doing. And it didn't quite work on Sunday. And we'll have to sort of see if the Falcons, they got a little bit, that C word, which is complacent, and we'll have to sort of see if they can rebound from that. I think they will. I think you sort of need to get punched in the face a couple of times before you realize, oh wait, I'm actually in a fight. That can work for some people. Not necessarily me, but some people need to get punched in the face a couple of times before they realize they need to, step their game up a little bit. And I think that, we can look back at this loss and being like, oh man, that was a really costly loss, or whatever the case may be, similar to that Miami game last year. But it has the potential to have a net positive over the course of these last couple of games, that the Falcons sort of avoid falling to that trap and play sort of put their A game forth over these last 7 games, and we'll sort of have to see what that results with.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest kind of telling factor as far as them just being lulled into a false sense of security, just going into this matchup. Whereas, I think the one positive, or the biggest positive from the Washington game, as far as an offensive standpoint and a game planning standpoint, is you could tell that they had some strategy as far as how that they were going to counteract, the Washington's defensive front, as far as them stopping the run, and they were going to use short passes and the Tevin Coleman screens and all that to be an extension of the run game. So they definitely put measures in for that game, but then, you fast forward to the next week as far as Cleveland goes, and you said they kind of just went about their traditional game plan without, ever taking into account how Cleveland was going to counteract that, or what Cleveland actually does from a defensive standpoint, being that they do run the cover 2 shell and they have their safeties deep, and you're basically playing 11 versus 9, at least up front. And I guess the one thing that I would have liked to see, maybe instead of, again, they're a heavy pass team, Atlanta. They rank as far as, up towards the top. I believe I saw today, like 67%, they're a passing offense. And that's up there with like Cleveland, or excuse me, Kansas City, and all the top team, Los Angeles, I believe. But I would have liked to seen them establish the run a little bit more. Again, we talked on last week's show, Cleveland being the 31st or 32nd ranked run defense. Before it became a 28-10 score, I mean, I charted the balance was 25-12 as far as pass to run. And it's not like they weren't running the ball effectively. I mean, other than a couple goal line situations and short yardage ones, they were at 50% success rate. So the fact that they didn't take advantage of those lighter boxes with the safeties being so far back just speaks to, again, the fact that they didn't come in with really much of a game plan. And hopefully, like you said, with them getting this punch to the mouth and be like, hey, we got to take every matchup seriously and have a plan for each opponent. Hopefully, because Dallas on the horizon runs a similar cover too. I'm curious to see how they're going to change things up. And Julio talked about it. They got to attack these cover 2s, because if they don't, defenses are going to throw it at them, and they're going to be stymied then for the rest of the year.
Yeah. Any other additional thoughts before we move on?
No, it's good for me.
Okay. We got 2 questions from Evan Birchfield dealing with this game. His first is, who is your brother of the week? And for those of you guys that don't know or aren't regular watchers of this show, the brother of the week is something that Evan came up with, is someone who stood out in the game but may or may not get quite the media attention that they normally would happen. So basically, like, someone who quietly had a really good game. So does anybody stand out for you in this Browns game?
So, we talked about KZ and Julio being bright spots. The one other bright spot, maybe you'll disagree with me based off the all-22, but I did think the offensive line did play pretty well. They only surrendered 4 quarterback hits. They had the 2 sacks, but I think both of them arguably could be on Matt Ryan in both instances. I know the last one, he held the ball way too long, had to get rid of it, and then took the sack and the fumble. So for me, holding a guy like Myles Garrett relatively quiet, I thought the 2 tackles were great. So I would, the whole offensive line in general, I thought had a pretty decent outing, but I think the tackles you can give to either one of them. I'm not sure, if you saw how many times Garrett was playing on what side. I know he flip-flopped, so I'm not sure you want to give the edge to either or who was playing him the most. But for me, I think those 2 guys, Schrader and Matthews, and Schrader's the last 2 weeks has improved his play after a very shaky early start. So that's encouraging to see, and hopefully we can see more of that in the future.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think I didn't really even notice Myles Garrett all that much in this game.
Yeah.
The offensive line wasn't perfect. I could certainly think of a handful of plays where they had some notable breakdowns, and it's like, gee whiz, I wish you would have made that block there, Schrader or Garland or Schweitzer or whoever it was. But yeah, I think this was, I've said it before, I don't think the offensive line has played particularly well this season. So I certainly think this game would certainly rank in the top 3 or 4 performances that they had. It was generally more favorable than it was unfavorable. this year. My brother of the week is going to be. I'm sorry.
Oh, this should be good.
I'm going to go with Bleedy Ray Wilson because basically the whole
here we go. Yep.
of the Falcons with their inactive list, or maybe it should be Keith Tandy because I guess technically he was probably the guy that got deactivated.
Yeah.
For Bruce Irvin, but it's just funny to me that
it's all Derek Shelby's fault.
This thing is still going. Like, the fact that the Falcons are 4-0 when they have 9 defensive backs active and 0-4 going into this game. And I tweeted it just sort of as a joke, like, oh yeah, like they're 0-4. And some people were like, oh yeah, well they'll be 1-4 after today. And it's like, nope, they're 0-5. So, this team goes as Bleedy Ray Wilson / Keith Tandy go. So we got another week to see what happens, but the Falcons going to have to figure out a way to get 9 DBs on the field this week, or, I don't know if things are going to go their way against Dallas.
What was their? Did you track this last year too?
I do have it somewhere. I don't, off the top of my head, but I know most weeks they usually do 8. That's been a pretty consistent thing under Dan Quinn. It's just weird that this year, if for some reason, it seems to fall in line with that.
The bad luck continues, I guess, this year.
Yeah. You just got to have Bleedy Ray Wilson ready to go on the sideline or something. I don't know.
Hey, I mean, I've always been pretty pleased with Bleedy Ray Wilson whenever he's been pressing the duty, so I'm cool with him being active if that's what it takes.
Okay. Evan's next question is basically the guy that, his question is, let me read the question, not hash it out. Thoughts on Bruce Irvin's first game. But basically what I was going to say is, in order to get Irvin active, they deactivated a DB. That was the most obvious player, extraneous player. But what were your thoughts on Bruce Irvin's first performance?
I mean, he made a couple plays. He flashed at times. You saw him too, which, again, they didn't get to feature it as much because of Cleveland's, game plan and stuff, but they featured him inside at times with Tack and Vic on the outside, and then, put Tack inside and had Vic and Bruce out there. So that, that'll be exciting. Hopefully we get to see the full sense of that against, even in this upcoming matchup, going up against, Tyron Smith and La'el Collins, 2 pretty decent players. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't anything to write home about, but he definitely made some plays. He was active at times in the run game and stuff. So I do think he's going to be a good addition and, going to improve the defensive line play somewhat. It just how much it, I don't know if it's going to be a whole lot, but I think you're going to see some improvement there. And again, I'm encouraged by what I saw and looking forward to see some more moving forward.
Yeah, he had a couple, 1 or 2 nice stops against the run. Didn't really get to see much from him as a pass rusher. That's kind of the case team-wide, because Cleveland was able to run the ball very effectively, and they sort of presented some personnel that required the Falcons to play a little bit more base, and they got a lead, and then they were able to run the football and continue to run the football late in the game and whatnot. So not too many opportunities for the Falcons to sort of pin their ears back and rush the quarterback, which is kind of what they brought in Bruce Irvin to do. Really, the only edge rushes that really stood out to me rewatching the game was, I think Brooks Reed had a couple of nice pass rushes, but that's, he got probably more reps. I didn't look at the snap counts, but he probably got more reps than a lot of the other guys like Tack and whatnot and Vic. And so, not a great, debut for Bruce Irvin, but I don't necessarily know if that's his fault. It's just sort of circumstances didn't really allow him to do the thing that you expect him to do best. So we'll have to see. I'm a little bit more optimistic that he'll be able to shine a little bit more against Dallas, although they have, Tyron Smith and, let's just say when the guy faces La'el Collins, they might have an opportunity to shine, but probably not so much against Tyrod. But we'll see how that goes. And speaking of which, let's talk about that Cowboys game. And, I think this is going to be an interesting game. I think we played the Cowboys last year, and I went into that game expecting the Falcons because that was the point in the season where I was like, oh, this Falcons season is over. So it seems sort of fortuitous that the Falcons are going into a similar situation where some people, have declared the Falcons' playoff hopes in their season pretty much dead after this disappointing Browns game, and they get maybe a little bit of a layup, you could argue, with the Cowboys. They are 4-5. They're not necessarily a bad team, but they play a certain style of football that, at least certainly last year, and from what I've seen of them this season, is sort of plays right into the Falcons' sort of hand a little bit. Their offense is very vanilla, and it was probably the most standout defensive performance that we saw from the Falcons in 2017, in large part due to the fact that their offense is very vanilla. And what I mean by that is they basically run, nothing complex in terms of their passing game. It's just sort of basically a bunch of man beaters. Dak sits back there, waits for somebody to get open, and throws him the football. And that has led to Dak not being, that offense hasn't necessarily functioned at a high level, and Dak hasn't been the most efficient guy. So, I think that certainly with the Falcons secondary and corners last year, that played into their hand, I think, a little bit. And the Falcons defensive line played really well against a very good Cowboys offensive line. This year's Cowboys offensive line, due to injuries to Travis Frederick and Connor Williams, who may or may not play this game. This offensive line is not as good as it has been in the past. So that's a positive for this Falcons defensive line. So I feel reasonably good that the Falcons defense will be able to take care of business against this Cowboys offense. To me, the big question is whether or not the Falcons offense can do what they normally do against a better than average Cowboys defense, particularly given how well their front seven is playing. I'm curious, Matt, what are your thoughts on this game and this matchup?
I mean, I don't say this often, but I actually agree with you on this one. And if we're both saying the same things, it's got to be true. I mean, I think the point you made about Dallas's offense being so vanilla, I think that does stack up favorably to the Falcons' defense. Because they don't have to be thinking too much. I mean, they run a simplified scheme, so if they can just go out and know what to expect from the Cowboys, that'll bode well in their favor. But yeah, I am most concerned about what the Cowboys defense, the challenge they're going to pose them, just because of the stuff I said earlier about them running a similar cover two, and they're definitely going to be using that Cleveland Browns tape to their advantage, and hopefully on the flip side, the Falcons learn a thing or two from that tape and scheme up ways to beat that coverage. Because if not, if games are close and it's low scoring, I'm going to favor a team like the Cowboys that can pound the rock and control time of possession. And I think the time of possession game was a huge factor in the first half in why Cleveland was able to get that lead and to establish their dominance in that game. So if Dallas can do something similar, this could be a repeat performance. So yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I think what the defense can do to us scares me a little bit more than what their offense can do.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that concerns me with their offense is Zeke, and
Sure.
The Falcons had two games where they did a good job stopping the run against New York and Washington.
Exactly.
And then had one horrible game against Cleveland. Now, maybe they just have some NFC East mojo. They're just good at stopping the run against NFC East teams. And if that's the case, then, maybe they'll have a nice rebound performance. But, yeah, they're going to have to stop the run. And if they can do that, then they'll have some opportunities, I think, particularly rushing the quarterback on third downs. You don't want to get this Cowboys offense. You don't want to let this Cowboys offense get into some third and manageables, because then they'll find ways to sustain their offense if they're facing a lot of 3rd and 5s and 3rd and 6s and 3rd and 2s. And that was an issue with Cleveland because they were able to be very successful on early downs and get into very few third downs. But then when they got into third downs, it was rarely a situation that even a young, inexperienced quarterback like Baker Mayfield couldn't handle. and he was very efficient at managing the game. And you don't want Dak to get in that same situation this week. So it's not as if the Cowboys can't do stuff offensively that can cause the Falcons problems. Obviously, you would feel a lot better being able to keep Zeke contained, particularly in the passing game, if Deion Jones is in this game. And so, that is a concern if he doesn't play. You do wonder, given the history this season with the Falcons, with receiving running backs have been mostly problematic. There have been some games where it hasn't been a major issue. It was last week. It wasn't the 2 weeks before. So again, you hope sort of they look more like the team that they played against the Giants and Redskins than necessarily the Browns. But yeah, I think my main issue is we've had a couple of games where the Falcons were effectively able to run the football. I think it's going to be a lot harder against this Cowboys team. That was one of the notable things watching that Cowboys game last year, which was, I think, the presence or the lack of availability of Sean Lee in that game, and Jalen Smith just not necessarily ready to step in and fill that void. I think Jalen Smith has been a much better player this season. Leighton Vander Esch has also been an effective playmaker for them. And they have, the Cowboys have the fourth ranked run defense, according to Football Outsiders DVOA. I think their defensive line is like number one in adjusted line yards or whatever. So it's going to be a tough sledding for this Falcons run game. And so that's why you're hoping that they can find some ways to get the passing game going.
That's what we thought about Washington game too. And lo and behold, they run for 150 plus yards. So again, that's why it's so tough to predict them at this point. We've seen the highs, we've seen what they're capable of, and if they bring that same effort, like you said, who knows? They could do the same thing to Dallas. So yeah, I do agree. I think obviously the offense is always looking at their peak efficiency when they're able to run the ball. So hopefully they can do that early on and establish it, and that'll set up everything off of that. But again, I wouldn't be surprised either way whether they can run the football well or they don't, just based off the fact that we've seen what they're capable of. So
yeah. They got to find a way to slow down DeMarcus Lawrence, because he's the guy that you got to be worried about. Randy Gregory's seeming like he's, he had a couple of nice rushes against the Eagles last week on Sunday night. But Lawrence is the main guy that you guys would worry about, because he's going to be primarily lined up at that left defensive end spot going up against Ryan Schrader. And while I think Schrader has been better these last couple of weeks, I don't think, some of the guys he's faced these last couple of games where he's looked better, with the exception of maybe Ryan Kerrigan, are quite on the level of DeMarcus Lawrence. And I think Lawrence gave him problems the last time we played the Cowboys, or the last couple of times we played the Cowboys. So that is going to be a situation where you don't want to get this Cowboys defensive line to be able to pin their ears back and be able to get after Matt Ryan. We'll have to see. Again, I think this Cowboys team is very beatable, particularly if the offense takes care of business, because I think if you can get the Cowboys in a shootout, their offense isn't necessarily, like, similar to Cleveland and some of these other teams like Washington.
Exactly.
They aren't built necessarily, have Dak drop back 40 plus times and win that way. And so, again, I think it boils down to the offense sort of getting things and controlling the tempo of this game, which wasn't the case last week, but was the previous game against Washington. So I think we all know the formula for the Falcons' success. We've seen it time and time again. And so if they can do that and find ways to do that, then they should be fine against this Cowboys team. But obviously, if things go awry, then things tend to get a little bit hairy for them.
Yep, I agree.
Okay, let's move on to the mailbag. Unless you have anything else you want to add.
I see here you have a prediction. Do we want to do that, or should we just move on to the mailbag?
I was going to skip it.
Just
because.
I'll just say I do feel pretty good about this game, but I don't really want to predict it. But
I will predict the Falcons win, but in terms of predicting a score, I don't feel good.
Yeah.
Just because this team is so all over the place.
Exactly.
Okay, let's get into the mailbag. Raekwon Gilbert at RX Gilbert 97 asks, which is more to blame on for Alford slash Trufant's struggles? A lack of pressure on the quarterback and changes made at both safety spots, despite KZ's progress, or neither player is having a good year?
I mean, I think the first thing definitely contributes to a secondary's play, but for me, I think it just comes down to they're having down seasons. It's as simple as that. I don't think they're playing up to the level that we've seen them play. I mean, it's funny how last year Robert Alford was arguably the best cornerback on the team, and that's not to say Desmond Trufant was playing bad. I just think Robert Alford had one of his best seasons of his career, and to see him be near the bottom of the league, at least according to Pro Football Focus, it's quite shocking, and you wonder if if he rushed himself back from that ankle injury, which kind of think he did because you heard all that week of practice that he was out. He could barely walk and move around, and to think that he's back and 100% after 1 week leads me to believe he wasn't. So I mean that could have a lot to do with it. And then Desmond Trufant, it's a curious case. A lot of people will talk about the dropped interceptions, and rightfully so, but I'm not sure if he's just lacking for confidence a little bit at times too. Since that injury, I'm not sure. I can't really put a finger on it. I mean, he's definitely not been the player he did to start his career. I mean, he hasn't been terrible, but you expect so much more, especially for what he's getting paid. And it's tough for me to place a finger on it, but lacking for confidence is the only thing I can think of. But yeah, to answer the question, I think it's more just they're having down seasons, and whether it be due to injury or lack of confidence, I'm not sure. But that's kind of where I would go with that one.
Yeah, well, look, I'm a hot take here. I don't think either guys have been nearly as bad as people have been made him out to be. I do think Alford probably wasn't healthy against that Cleveland Brown game. There was a couple plays. I can't remember specifically, but there was one where he got beat on like a slant where he was just sort of stuck in the mud, and I think that's just due to the ankle not being there, and he didn't play with the balance that he normally does in that given play where a guy crosses his face, because one of the things that he does best, or at least historically has been, is defend, in breaking routes and whatnot. So, I think, the touchdown he gave up, I think that is partially owed to the fact that he sort of had outside leverage on that play, thinking that he would get the safety help from KZ. I'm not blaming that on KZ or anything like that, but I think he played it away initially where he was like, oh, my safety's going to help me out, and the safety didn't help him out. And then he had to try to make up for it. And, Baker Mayfield made a great throw, and that was a touchdown. I think Trufant has been mostly mostly solid this year. But he's given up some plays. That's been the case. The Pro Football Focus grading, I think Pro Football Focus is a great website and a great resource for a lot of things. The grades, I don't necessarily put a whole lot of stock, particularly in the coverage grades and various other grades that they give out, but that's a conversation for another day. So, the fact that Alford has been so low graded, and I think one of the things I've also noticed with the Pro Football Focus grades, and again, not to disparage the website, but when you have a really, really high grade or really, really low grade in a game, it sort of brings down, even if you grade out like average or above average in other games, it's going to lower the overall score. So if like you have a 90 grade and then you have a whole bunch of 60s, a guy will still have like an 80 grade overall. Or if you have like a 30 grade and a whole bunch of 60s, a guy will have like a 40 grade. I've noticed that tendency with a lot of their grading things. And I think with Alford, I didn't see this grade that he had against that Giants game, but yeah, that was a horrible game that he had. So that may be lowering his, overall grade a little bit more than I think maybe it should. But I think with our cornerback play, I think there's a lot of factors. Obviously, I don't, even though I'm defending them, I don't think they're necessary. They've obviously played much better than they are playing right now. But I think, the sort of panic that people are like, oh, these guys are playing poorly or playing bad or anything like that, I think that's being over exaggerated a little bit. So I think they're still solid corners, still above average starters. Whether their Pro Football Focus grades reflect that, doesn't necessarily affect me or whatnot in my perspective on that. But I think they're both, be poised for a rebound season when the Falcons get their starting safeties back, as well as address some of their pass rush issues. And I think we'll look at this one season as, oh yeah, that was maybe a little bit more because of what was going on with the rest of the defense than necessarily those two guys just not having it or losing whatever they got left in the tank and whatnot. So. Brian, at your homeboy Brian asked, do you expect Deion Jones to play versus Dallas? I'm going to be mad if they hold him out until the Saints game. We are fighting for our playoff lives. And a similar question from Evan Birchfield is, how much better will Deion Jones make the defense?
Well, Brian, I would prepare yourself to be mad a little bit because I think it's possible that they hold him out one more week and save him because of that short week heading into New Orleans, and you roll the dice and you hope that what they have is good enough to beat a Dallas team, which we mentioned that the offense isn't that scary. It really comes down to, can our offense dictate that matchup? So again, we'll know more on Wednesday based on the practice schedule. I mean, he didn't do a whole lot last week, so we'll see if they saw enough that he can go full go on Wednesday. And if that's the case, I mean, if he's right off the blocks on Wednesday, then I think you can't expect him to play. But if he's limited, then we'll have to probably wait till Friday to get the final answer. And then, as far as what he's going to do for the defense, I don't think we should expect any sort of huge skyrocket up to the top 10 or anything like that. I think a return to normalcy or return to, an average unit that still, again, will struggle to get after the quarterback, can only vault you up so high. But, Deion's impact there should help in the run game. You're not going to see poor run fits from the linebacking crew like we've seen at times with the inexperienced players. And then obviously in coverage, you're talking about inserting one of the best coverage linebackers in football. And I know, the Pro Football Focus Falcons account, tweeted out something last week about Deion's effect on the field as far as pass yards per play, and it's up towards the top of the league, so that's definitely going to help. I mean, you can expect if the Falcons can get teams into third and longs, the great aspect of Deion Jones was rallying to the football, keeping things in front of the team and forcing the opponent to dump it down, and then you'd see Deion Jones be the first guy to the ball and stop him short. So that's the types of stuff you can look forward to seeing again when he's back in the lineup. But again, we can't expect anything crazy as far as his impact. But I mean, again, he's going to have a tangible effect in certain areas, like I mentioned.
Yeah, I think, as for him playing this week, I have no idea. I'm not overly optimistic about it, but then again, I didn't think they were going to sign Bruce Irvin. So, at this point, I'll pump the brakes on making too many bold predictions at this point in the week. As for his impact on defense, we'll see. If he plays against the Saints, we know historically he is great against the Saints. So, there's a good chance that he'll come out in that game and look like, oh my God, this defense is great now because Deion Jones, single-handedly got 3 pick sixes or something like that. But we'll see where he is, because I think it's interesting, because if you go back and watch him in week 1, he was, I would certainly make the case, the best defensive player on the field that day, and by far the best defensive player on the field.
He was awesome.
And so if he plays that way for 6-7 games, however many it is, then yeah, that's going to have a significant impact on the defense, because that, to me, was one of the better performances we've seen from Deion Jones in his entire career. I would say, whether he, plays at that level coming off of a foot injury, I wouldn't necessarily be like, oh yeah, he's definitely going to be that guy. But I'm hoping, again, whether he plays 6 or 7 games, I'm hoping we can see that guy 3 or 4 times this year. If we do that, then that's going to have a significant impact in whatever those 3 or 4 games are, or something close to that. So he has the potential to have a significant impact on the defense. Again, as Matt said, I don't necessarily think you're going to expect this defense to suddenly turn into a top 10 defense or anything like that. But I think in terms of his playmaking ability, and improving their ability to get off the field on third downs and give this offense more opportunities to put points up the board, I think you can see that. I think, in specifically in terms of like not having the coverage breakdowns that they seem to have in the middle of the field. Thank you, Duke Riley. I think that will be a thing of the past. And, that alone could account for probably a significant number of the yards that the Falcons and touchdowns the Falcons seem to give up this season. If I went back and charted it, it would probably be like, I don't know, it seems like it's like 40% of the yards just come from basic, simple checkdowns to the running back that turn into, turn from 4-yard gains to like 12-yard gains and whatever. But yeah, so I think he could have a significant impact, but I wouldn't necessarily. People think that suddenly the Falcons are going to be considered one of the best defenses in the league down the stretch, but certainly he can have a dramatic impact and help the Falcons win several games. Brian asks, why do you think we struggle against AFC teams under Dan Quinn? What do you think we can do to change that? I've got Baltimore penciled in as the toughest game left on our schedule, even over Green Bay and the Saints because of this.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I think common sense would say, these AFC teams, you're only playing them once every 4 years. So, you don't have a lot of experience or a lot of film yourself going up against them. And, as much as we praise Dan Quinn for being, a great talent evaluator, great motivator, except for obviously this last week, not a great motivator, I guess. I don't think he's the greatest X's and O's or game management or game planning type of coach. And, because of that, you're not going to see him try to do a whole lot of different things based off of the opponent that he's playing. He goes out there, obviously, and runs that simplified cover 3, cover 1 defense, and he relies on the talent that he has to win out. So that could have something to do with it. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure there's a clear answer either way on something like this, but that's kind of what I was tossing around in my head as a possible suggestion for maybe why they struggle with the AFC teams, since they don't see him often, whereas the NFC teams, I mean, he's seen them now a handful of times before and kind of has an idea of, of what it takes to beat those teams. So again, I'm not sure either way, but those are some of my suggestions as far as maybe why it is.
Yeah, I think, speaking of Dan Quinn's, X's and O's ability, he's not necessarily known as a scheming guru when it comes to defense. And because he's a defensive guy, he doesn't necessarily have as much control over the offense and whatnot. And I think, not to sort of blame it on Sark, but I think you could probably relate it a little bit to Sark's lack of NFL experience. And, this AFC thing wasn't as stark an issue under Kyle Shanahan, who spent the bulk of his career coaching in the AFC, or a significant portion of it outside the, 4 or 5 years he was in Washington. And so there was probably a little bit more familiarity with what these teams do, because beating AFC teams wasn't a major issue in 2015. They lost to San Diego and Kansas City in 2016, but again, you can argue that maybe the offense let them down in the second halves of those games, but I don't necessarily know if it was because of poor offensive performances. And some of these other games against the AFC teams under Sark, you have really seen the offense sort of struggle quite a bit, with the exception of the Cincinnati game.
But why would, I mean, he's had success now against these NFC teams, and he doesn't have the body of work against them that, an experienced play caller. I mean, Sark's only now in year 2 of being an NFL play caller. So why is he had success then? That's why I'm hesitant to say that that's what it could be.
Yeah, well, that's a very fair point. I don't necessarily have a counter to that. So, in terms of, that's why I'm not.
It's a tough one. I mean,
so I think it's, instead of pointing out Sark, maybe it's a team thing. And in these instances, you could argue, again, this is pure speculation, so take this with a grain of salt. But you could argue in the past, Shanahan could take the lead on some of these things and be like, okay, this is what this team does, this is what this team does, and we're going to attack them this way. And because of that overall lack of familiarity, you mentioned that they only play these teams once every 4 years, and then sort of, Greg Knapp is coaching the AFC for a large part, but Raheem Morris, so you don't necessarily have the familiarity that you can fall back on, and you don't have the offensive coordinator that can sort of spearhead it and say, like, take the bull by the horns and be like, this is what we're going to do this week against this team. We're going to attack them this way. So it's probably not fair to me to single out Sark, but I think it's maybe a difference maybe in maybe how Shanahan would approach it versus what Sark is going to do. And so maybe, again, I don't know.
There's a lot of random things though in football too, and this could just be one of them. I mean, I don't know. I don't think there's a lot to it. I just think, again, just like with injuries and stuff and how the ball bounces in any given Sunday and what we just saw last week, I mean, that should have been a slam dunk game and it wasn't. So you just never know in the NFL from a week-to-week basis. And I think a stat like this, the Falcons' record against the AFC under Dan Quinn might be one of those as well. Who knows? But I just think it's so tough to pinpoint it on one thing. It's just one of those things.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. My counter would be just like losing 9 out of your last 10 against the AFC. It becomes a little bit hard to be like, oh, it's just, sometimes the ball doesn't bounce your way. Like, if you lost 9 out of 10 at anything, or 90% of, like that's a steady pattern.
Yeah, but I mean, we had a pattern like that with the whole Devontae Freeman, Tevin Coleman. Is the offense better when it's just Tevin type of thing? And again, that's one of those things where I don't even know if that's true, but there is a pretty large size sample. And, whether it be, I think Marco at Vienna Falcons wrote an article about it being the level of defenses they're going up against. But again, I just think there's a lot of random things sometimes in football. And, with the constant turnover on teams too, as far as coaching staffs, sometimes you just, maybe that plays into it, because again, there wasn't a lot to go off of with Greg Williams and Freddie Kitchens running the show in Cleveland. There was just the one game, and sometimes that's not enough to game plan against a team. And clearly that was the case this past week. They threw some stuff that they hadn't seen. So I don't know. It's tough. I mean, so.
No, that's all fair. You can certainly look at each individual instance and find a reason besides they're just not good against AFC teams. But it just seems to be there's a pattern here, and we'll have to see if they can, figure it out against Baltimore if we see another.
Yeah, I mean, going off again of what he was saying about Baltimore being the toughest, even though the AFC struggles, I still think it's that Green Bay game is going to be the toughest one and going to be the one that decides whether they get into the playoffs or not. Granted that they take care of some business now this week, but for me, I think that Baltimore one, now depending on their situation at quarterback with Joe Flacco or if Lamar Jackson's the guy now, that could throw a wrinkle into that, but I still think that Green Bay game is tougher than the home one against the Ravens. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, I would generally say that, but Falcons historically do a pretty good job against Green Bay, and Baltimore has a pretty good defense.
But not in Lambeau, though. I mean, I think the only time that they won was Matt Ryan's rookie year, if I'm not mistaken. So that's what scares me a little bit going into December in Lambeau. Is much different than the last 3 at home. So
yeah, but I think in terms of teams, not necessarily venue, I think Baltimore may be a tougher matchup than Green Bay is.
It's possible.
But, then again, you do have the Falcons seem to be a much different team at home versus on the road. So it may wind up, balancing out either in the opposite direction. So we'll see. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I need to watch more of Baltimore. I haven't really watched too much of them. I just know their defense is good. And I know Joe Flacco hasn't looked terrible for large stretches of the season.
He was decent early on, but I think he's really regressed back to typical Flacco.
Okay, there you have it. There's your Baltimore Ravens scouting report 2 weeks in advance. Evan Birchfield's next question is: what percentage chance do the Falcons have at making the playoffs? What remaining games will they win/lose, in your opinion?
I think if we want like the mathematical answer to start with, I think it's like at this point it's like 7% I saw, or 5 to 7%. But if they can win in Dallas, it's strange because a couple weeks, obviously, well, maybe it's not strange because when they were left for dead at 1-4, we already were saying, oh yeah, don't think about a Falcons win on Thanksgiving night against New Orleans. But I'm one of those guys that kind of plays the odds sometimes when I'm looking at games and seeing how the Saints have rattled off, what is it, 9 in a row since losing the week 1 game against Tampa. And they're playing the Eagles this week, who haven't looked good, and I believe it's at home in New Orleans. So I kind of want to chalk that up to a win. So at that point, they're riding a 10-game win streak. I feel like they got to slip up eventually. So for me, it's a division game. Those games are always close. If we got a healthy Deion Jones in there, that gives us even more of a fighting chance. We didn't have him in week 1 or week 2. Week 3 when we played them at home, and that was, came down to the wire. So again, if we can take care of business against Dallas, I'd give ourselves a shot to get to 6-5 and knock off the Saints. But even if we didn't, again, it comes back to that Green Bay game. If we can win that one, I wouldn't be shocked if they go on a run and pull off, what is it, their next 5 and go to 10-6. So I still, as crazy as it may seem, I still see somewhat of a road to getting to 10-6, which I think is at the very worst record that it would take once again this year to get to that 6th spot. So yeah, I mean, I still think it's possible. But again, we talked about it already. This team's so volatile. You don't know what you're going to get from them on a week-to-week basis. So you really have to take it one game at a time to really see. But again, if they can pick themselves back up and win, and hopefully win convincingly maybe against Dallas, and if Deion Jones is there and he's doing what he's doing, again, you got to feel somewhat confident that they can maybe get back into it with the schedule that they have left.
Yeah, I mean, look, basically they need to get to 8-6 by that Week 16 game against Carolina. Like, if they can get to 8-6 before that game, they're in a reasonably good position. Doesn't mean that they're definitely going to get in or anything, but they'll basically control their own destiny going into that Week 16 game. Or you would hope reasonably control their own destiny.
Yeah, I think
so that means
right.
They got to win 4 out of the next 5 games, which is doable. But coming off of this Browns game, I don't feel as confident that they're going to do that as I would have a week ago, because they had a little bit more leeway where it was like, okay, you beat the Browns, and then you only have to win 3 out of your next 5 games, and you're still at that 8-6 mark. So now they're going to, you look at these next 5 games, you got Dallas at New Orleans, Baltimore at Green Bay, home for Arizona. That New Orleans game on the short week on the road is probably the toughest game for the Falcons to win. Historically, the Falcons, particularly Falcons-Saints matchup, based off of who's playing at home, these Thursday night games, who's playing at home, more often than not, based off of what I've seen, sort of determines who's going to win that game. So that basically means if you're going to chalk that game up as a loss, that means Dallas is a must-win, Baltimore is a must-win, Green Bay is a must-win, Arizona is a must-win. Again, all doable, but I think that Baltimore-Green Bay game, those 2 games are going to be the 2 hiccups in there. I feel reasonably confident that they'll beat Dallas. I feel reasonably confident that they'll beat Arizona. Then again, I felt reasonably confident they would beat Cleveland as well. So, I mean, it's going to be tough. If you're asking me right now, like I probably wouldn't put a lot of money on the Falcons making the playoffs, but if they beat Dallas this week, I would be a little bit more optimistic. It's just tough to be overly optimistic given sort of losing this Cleveland Browns game. It would be different if they had played well and we just saw a different Browns team and we thought that this, oh man, this Browns team has just outplayed a Falcons team. Like the Cincinnati game, that loss, while not a good loss, you don't feel as bad about it because you do feel like the Falcons, without some of their defensive breakdowns, gave one of the better offensive performances of the season in that game. This Browns game was arguably their worst offensive performance. And so that's the strength of the team. And so if we're going to see more, like they can't afford to have another game like this offensively. And whether that means scoring, 27, 28, 35, 38, or whatever it is that they need to score for the rest of the season, they're going to have to do that. And that's tough to do every single week. There's going to be some games where you're going to have some down weeks. Now, fortunately, if Deion Jones comes back and the defense isn't, terrible, maybe you can win some games 24-21, which seemed virtually impossible for most of the season. Just a fantasy until that Giants game. So we'll have to see. But, I think there's a shot. I don't think their season is over, certainly, but their backs are against the wall a little bit. And so we're going to have to see what this team is able to put forward over the next month. If they go 3-2 over the next month, it's going to be really hard for them to, they're going to need a lot of help, basically. And so if they can go 4-1, they're in the driver's seat.
Yep.
Our last question comes from Lasada128 on Twitter. He asks, how can we possibly win the Super Bowl this year with a loss to the Browns? Would this team make it in the toilet bowl?
Saving the best for last.
Yeah.
I don't think Super Bowl there's any shot, honestly. I mean, that's kind of where I would go with the question. If they get in the playoffs and rally, after how it started, I think that's a successful season to me. I know not a lot of people maybe will feel that way. I mean, we definitely probably for sure didn't feel that way going in, but again, a lot of things out of the team's control happened, and to pick ourselves up and to put ourselves in a position, again, it's very disheartening that they've set themselves back even more after last week's performance. But again, we just talked about it. I mean, there's still a shot. Can they, yes, if they play up to their potential, they can get into the playoffs and, maybe even do the same like they did last year and knock a team off if, say Minnesota is staring them in the face, having this play indoors and stuff and not having to go in inclement weather in January, such as Chicago maybe or Green Bay or somewhere. So they can do that much. But as far as Super Bowl dreams, yeah, for me, that's not even really on my mind at this point. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Look, I thought they were first, second round playoff team going into the season.
Mm. And
then, with the injuries, once Jones and Neal got hurt, I was like, well, that's over.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still a shot that they can make the playoffs.
Yeah.
But going into the season thinking like, okay, I could see this team making it to the second round of the playoffs, and if you can make it to the second round of the playoffs, you get a couple breaks here or there. The team plays a little bit better than I think they are. Then that's a potential Super Bowl contender. That's an NFC championship. You're a game away from the NFC championship game, and thus you're a game away from the Super Bowl. But once Neal and Jones got injured, I think sort of second round of the playoffs would have been the absolute best case scenario where everything goes right for them, which is, again, it's still a mathematical possibility. But at this point in time, I think, as you said, I think right now your best case scenario is just making the playoffs. And if they get, bounced in the first round by the Vikings or whoever they wind up playing, or the Bears or whoever it is, then, so be it. But I think, Super Bowl aspirations died the day that Keanu Neal went on IR, in my humble opinion.
But, yeah, I mean, it's frustrating because I think the offense, again, when it's clicking, is a Super Bowl offense, but the defense has to carry some weight. Even like they did in 2016, they started hitting their stride when the younger players started adapting to their roles. And we have to see what Deion Jones, how healthy he is when he does come back and what he brings to the team, because he will provide a boost, but it really comes down to, the defensive line. They don't have Claiborne, they don't have Poe, and, Tack has been quiet the last couple of weeks, and Vic really would need to return to 2016 form where he's just turning the pressures that he does get into sacks, and Irvin would have to chip in a few and stuff in order for me to really believe that then maybe they have something here, two parts working as one. But so far, the sample size has said that's not going to really happen, all three working like that. So that's kind of why their ceiling is very limited this year until they get those guys back in 2019.
Yeah, look, the offense is good. The offense is certainly playoff caliber. Whether they're Super Bowl caliber, I don't know. I think there's.
I mean, you don't think 28 points a game when they're clicking like they have is that's.
I mean, I think on paper they are. I think the issue I'm having is we haven't really seen that offense play that way against. The problem is they haven't played that way consistently on the road, which they're going to have to be in order to make a Super Bowl run.
That Washington game. So you honestly, I guess, didn't put that defense into as high a standard as
No, I did, but that's literally one time out of like.
Well, yeah, I know, and that's why they're inconsistent, and that's why you can't count on something like that. But again,
so that's my issue. Like it's one of those things. Like if we can consistently see that, I would feel reasonably comfortable or reasonably confident that they could win 3 road games against playoff caliber teams. But because
even the Kyle Shanahan offenses, faltered against the better defenses in the league, and again, they were more consistent. I'll give you that. But I mean, they had their struggles against better defenses. The thing is, they didn't really see the good defenses then come playoff time, which worked in their favor, obviously. But
yeah, look, I think I didn't start really buying in the Falcons offense being like, oh, maybe this is a Super Bowl caliber team until they wax the Panthers and the Saints in that week 17 game back in 2016. That was sort of my like, oh, we are legitimately really, really good offense, and maybe this all. And so I think it's not to say that I don't think this current offense is capable of that. I just haven't seen it yet. We've seen flashes of it here. So it's like, to me, like, okay, if they come out and drop, 35 against the Saints and 35 against the Ravens and 35 in Lambeau or whatnot, then I think that's when we can really start to have like, okay, maybe this offense is legitimately good enough to carry even this lackluster defense, hypothetically, again, not saying that this is going to happen this year, but hypothetically, this offense might be good enough to sort of carry this team. And then we can sort of talk about, did we waste an opportunity this year? I personally, right now, I don't feel like we're wasting a legitimate Super Bowl run. I just think this is kind of a year, this is a reloading year, I guess you maybe chalk it up as.
I think we're wasting a great season from Matt Ryan. Now, would your answer have been different today if Falcons are coming off a 31-21 victory in Cleveland?
Probably.
Yeah, it's so crazy how 1 week can just shift the pendulum. It's nuts. But yeah, I don't disagree.
Even if they lost this Cleveland Browns game like 28-27, I'd probably feel a little bit better about it.
No, I don't disagree with you.
Yeah, it is what it is. I mean,
it's one of those years.
I say it's not a week-to-week league, but then sometimes my answers change week to week. So, yeah. There's a lot of football left to be played, is what I'll say.
Absolutely.
And so it's just really about, like, will this team consistently show up over, the next 7 games? 5 out of the next 7 games, will they perform well? And if they do, then, I'll reserve the right to change my answer. I'm not ready to declare like this was an offense that was going to go and drop 30 on Minnesota and then drop 30 on the Rams and then drop 30 on the Saints in the postseason and whatnot and make that run. But maybe I'll change my opinion by the time we get to December and then maybe January.
Yep.
So, guys, there you have it. We appreciate you tuning in this week on Falcon Central Radio. We'll be back next week to talk about this Cowboys game as well as talk about the short week and the turnaround going in that Thanksgiving game against the Saints. Because of the holiday week, we might have to tweak the schedule a little bit, but we'll figure it out. We'll definitely keep you updated, and you can find those updates with me on Falcons on Twitter, as well as the show's Twitter handle, Falcons PFC. If you want to get your mailbag questions answered on next week's show, you can use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. Be sure to check us out on YouTube at the Pro Football Central page, and make sure you hit that subscribe and bell icon so that you get our live updates. And of course, follow us on Facebook at Falcon Central Radio. Matt, let the people know what you got going on.
Yeah, so I'm in the midst of brainstorming my next mailbag piece at riseupreader.com. So if you have more questions, whether it's related to the season or if you even want to talk off season and draft, I'm always happy to do that. So, yeah, I got that coming up later this month, hopefully. So tweet me your questions at Matt Karoly, MattKaroly.
There you have it. All right, guys, have a good night.